Hey everyone, I know this might sound crazy, but I rented a cabin in the woods off the dark web. I know, stupid, right? But it was supposed to be an adventure, something to break the monotony of my life. I was bored out of my mind, and the idea of escaping to a secluded spot for a weekend sounded perfect. Little did I know, it would turn into the worst decision of my life. So, it all started a few weeks ago. I was browsing the internet, looking for something interesting to do. Regular travel sites were too boring, too predictable. I wanted something unique, something different. That's when I stumbled upon this thread on a shady forum. People were talking about renting places off the dark web, hidden gems you wouldn't find anywhere else. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to dive in. I managed to find a listing for a cabin in the middle of nowhere. The description was vague, but the pictures showed a quaint little wooden house surrounded by dense forest. It looked perfect, isolated, and serene. I contacted the owner, a guy who went by the username Woodland Wanderer. He was quick to respond, and after a brief conversation, I wired him the payment. The next day, I received the location coordinates and a set of instructions. The drive up was uneventful. The cabin was located deep within the woods, far away from any signs of civilization. The road was narrow and winding, barely wide enough for my car. By the time I arrived, it was late afternoon, and the sun was beginning to set. The cabin looked just like the pictures, rustic and charming. I couldn't wait to start my weekend of relaxation. I unpacked my stuff and settled in. The cabin was basic, but cozy. It had a small living room, a kitchen, and a single bedroom. There was no electricity, but there were oil lamps and plenty of firewood. I lit a fire in the fireplace and made myself a cup of instant coffee. As the evening turned into night, I felt a strange sense of peace. The silence of the forest was almost therapeutic. But then, things started to get weird. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or something. But the footsteps were too heavy, too deliberate. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it through the window, but there was nothing there. Just the dark, empty woods. I shook it off as my imagination playing tricks on me and went to bed. The next morning, I found something strange. There were muddy footprints on the porch, leading up to the front door. They were human footprints, barefoot and large. My heart started pounding. Someone had been outside while I was sleeping. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a local or a hiker passing by. But deep down, I knew something was off. I spent the day exploring the woods around the cabin. It was beautiful, but there was an eerie silence that I couldn't shake. No birds chirping, no rustling leaves, just dead quiet. As the day wore on, I felt like I was being watched. Every now and then I'd catch a glimpse of something moving in the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. That night, things escalated. I was in bed, trying to sleep, when I heard it again. The footsteps. This time, they were closer, right outside my window. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped, and there was a soft tapping on the glass. My blood ran cold. I didn't dare move. After what felt like an eternity, the tapping stopped, and the footsteps retreated into the woods. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I found more footprints, this time around the entire cabin. Whoever it was had been circling the place. I was terrified. I wanted to leave, but I had no cell reception, and the nearest town was miles away. I was trapped. Desperate, I searched the cabin for anything I could use to defend myself. In the kitchen, I found a rusty old knife. It wasn't much, but it made me feel a little better. I spent the day barricading the doors and windows, hoping it would keep whatever was out there at bay. As night fell, the sense of dread grew stronger. I sat in the living room, clutching the knife, listening. The silence was oppressive, suffocating. And then, just as I was starting to relax, I heard it. A low, guttural growl coming from the woods. My heart raced. I stood up, peering out the window, but I couldn't see anything. The growling grew louder, closer. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, primal and menacing. I backed away from the window, my hands trembling. Suddenly, the front door burst open with a loud bang. I screamed, raising the knife, but there was no one there. Just the empty doorway, leading into the dark night. The growling had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I didn't dare step outside. Instead, I slammed the door shut and pushed a heavy dresser in front of it. Hours passed. I was on edge, every little noise making me jump. Then, Just as I was starting to think it was over, I heard it, a soft whisper coming from the bedroom. It was faint, almost inaudible, but it sent chills down my spine. I crept towards the bedroom, knife in hand, and slowly opened the door. The room was empty, but the whispering continued. It seemed to be coming from the closet. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and yanked the closet door open. There was nothing inside, just darkness. But the whispering grew louder, filling the room. I felt a cold breeze brush past me, and the whispering turned into a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, incomprehensible and maddening. I slammed the closet door shut and backed away, my heart pounding. The voices stopped abruptly, leaving a deafening silence. I was shaking, my mind racing. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I had to get out of there. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the living room, clutching the knife. When morning finally came, I wasted no time. I grabbed my things and bolted for the car. The drive back felt like a blur, my mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. By the time I got home, I was exhausted, physically and mentally. I haven't been able to shake the feeling that something followed me back. Every night since I returned, I've heard strange noises, whispers in the dark. I'm afraid to go to sleep, afraid of what might be waiting in the shadows. I don't know what I encountered in that cabin, but I know one thing: I'll never go back. And if you ever come across a listing for a cabin in the woods on the dark web, do yourself a favor and stay far, far away. I thought once I was back home, things would return to normal. I mean, logically, what could follow me from a remote cabin in the woods, right? But the unease I felt was overwhelming, like a dark cloud hanging over me. The noises, the whispers, they persisted every night, making sleep impossible. I decided to take some time off work, thinking maybe I just needed to rest and clear my head. The first night back, I was too exhausted to do anything but crash on the couch. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a scratching sound. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to hear where it was coming from. It seemed to be coming from inside the walls. I convinced myself it was probably rats or some other pest and decided to deal with it in the morning. But then, something happened that made me question my sanity. As I lay there, trying to fall back asleep, I felt something brush against my cheek. I froze, too scared to move. Slowly, I reached for my phone and turned on the flashlight. The room was empty, but the sensation had been real. Too real. The next morning, I called an exterminator to check the house for pests. He didn't find anything. No rats, no insects, nothing that could explain the scratching noises. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just imagining things. But the fear gnawed at me. I decided to do some research on the cabin. Maybe there was a logical explanation for everything that had happened. I scoured the internet, looking for any mention of the place. After hours of searching, I finally found something. An old newspaper article about a series of disappearances in the area where the cabin was located. The article mentioned a local legend about a Wendigo, a creature from Native American folklore said to haunt the woods and prey on humans. I didn't believe in such things, but the article gave me chills. The description of the Wendigo, tall, emaciated, with glowing eyes and a hunger for human flesh, matched the feeling of being watched I had experienced in the woods. I tried to push the thought out of my mind, but it kept creeping back like a sinister shadow. That night, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. I couldn't understand the words, but they filled me with a sense of dread. I decided to sleep with the lights on, hoping it would keep whatever was haunting me at bay. Around 3 a.m., I heard a loud bang coming from the basement. My heart skipped a beat. I had always hated the basement, dark, damp, and filled with old, forgotten things. I grabbed a flashlight and the rusty knife I had brought back from the cabin. My hands were shaking as I made my way downstairs. The basement door creaked open, and the stench of mold hit me like a wave. I slowly descended the stairs, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. When I reached the bottom, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There were muddy footprints on the floor, leading to the far corner of the basement. My breath caught in my throat as I followed the trail. The footprint stopped in front of an old wooden chest. I had never seen it before. It looked ancient, covered in cobwebs and dust. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to turn back, to run, but something compelled me to open the chest. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid. Inside, I found a collection of old photographs and journals. The photos were of people I didn't recognize, their faces twisted in expressions of fear and pain. The journals were filled with ramblings about dark rituals and sacrifices. As I flipped through the pages, I felt a presence behind me. I spun around, knife raised, but there was no one there. Just the oppressive darkness. The air felt thick, suffocating. I heard a whisper in my ear, so close it made me jump. "Leave," it said, in a voice that was not my own. I bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind me. I felt like I was losing my mind. I decided I needed help. I called my friend Jake, someone who would believe me without thinking I was completely nuts. He agreed to come over and stay the night to help me figure out what was going on. When Jake arrived, I told him everything. He listened, his expression growing more serious with every word. "This is messed up, man," he said. "We need to figure out what's happening." We decided to set up a camera in the living room, hoping to capture any strange occurrences. As night fell, the house grew eerily quiet. We sat in the living room trying to keep ourselves awake, but exhaustion eventually took over. Around 4 a.m., I was jolted awake by a blood-curdling scream. It took me a moment to realize it was coming from Jake. I found him in the hallway, staring at the bathroom door. "There's something in there," he whispered, his face pale. I grabbed the flashlight and knife, my heart pounding. Together we slowly opened the door. The bathroom was empty, but the mirror was fogged up, as if someone had taken a hot shower. Written in the condensation were the words, "Get out." My blood ran cold. This was no prank, no figment of my imagination. Something was haunting us. We didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When morning finally came, we reviewed the footage from the camera. What we saw chilled us to the bone. Around 3 a.m., a shadowy figure appeared in the living room. It moved with an unnatural, jerky motion, stopping to stare directly into the camera, before disappearing into the hallway. The same hallway where Jake had heard the scream. I knew then that this wasn't something we could fight. We had to leave, to get as far away from the house as possible. But a part of me feared it was already too late, that whatever darkness had attached itself to me from that cabin wouldn't let go so easily. As we packed our things, I found a note slipped under the front door. It was written in a spidery, unfamiliar handwriting. "You can't escape. It will follow you. Always." Leaving the house was supposed to be the solution. Jake and I packed up everything we could and bolted out of there, not looking back. We drove to his place, a few towns over, thinking we could regroup and figure out our next move in the safety of his home. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, even as we sped down the highway. When we got to Jake's place, the first thing we did was make sure every door and window was locked. It felt paranoid, but we didn't want to take any chances. We spent the rest of the day talking, trying to come up with a plan. Jake suggested we contact a paranormal expert, someone who could help us understand what we were dealing with. I agreed, but deep down, I was skeptical. This thing, whatever it was, felt beyond human comprehension. That night, we stayed up late again, too scared to sleep. Around midnight, Jake's dog, Rufus, started growling at something outside. Rufus was usually a calm dog, but now he was barking like crazy, his fur standing on end. We looked out the window but saw nothing. Jake tried to calm him down, but Rufus wouldn't stop barking. Suddenly the lights flickered and the house was plunged into darkness. My heart raced as we fumbled for our flashlights. The air grew colder and I could see my breath in the dim light. We heard footsteps upstairs, slow and deliberate. It was impossible. We were alone in the house. At least, we were supposed to be. We made our way upstairs, the flashlight beam shaking in our hands. The footsteps stopped as we reached the top of the stairs. The hallway was empty, but the door to Jake's bedroom was ajar. We could hear a faint whispering coming from inside. Jake and I exchanged a terrified glance before pushing the door open. The room was empty, but the whispering continued, louder now. It seemed to be coming from the closet. My stomach churned as we approached. Jake flung the closet door open, revealing nothing but darkness. The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence. We stood there, hearts pounding, trying to make sense of what was happening. Suddenly, Rufus started barking again, this time from downstairs. We rushed back down to find him standing in the living room, barking at the front door. There were scratch marks on the wood, deep and jagged, as if something had tried to claw its way in. Jake looked at me, his face pale. "This is getting out of hand," he said. "We need help." The next day, we contacted a paranormal investigator named Karen. She had a reputation for dealing with extreme cases, and we hoped she could provide some answers. When she arrived, she immediately sensed the tension in the house. She walked through each room, her face growing more serious with every step. "This presence," she said, "it's not just haunting you, it's attached to you. Whatever you encountered in that cabin, it latched onto you, and it's not going to let go easily." I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach. "Is there anything we can do?" I asked. Karen nodded. "We need to perform a cleansing ritual. It won't be easy, and it might not completely rid you of this entity, but it should weaken its hold." That night, Karen prepared for the ritual. She set up candles and incense around the house and chanted incantations in a language I didn't understand. The air grew thick with tension, and the shadows seemed to dance in the flickering candlelight. Jake and I watched nervously, hoping this would work. As Karen began the final part of the ritual, the temperature in the room dropped suddenly. The candles flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. The whispers returned, louder and more menacing. We heard the sound of something scraping against the walls, moving closer. I could feel a cold breath on my neck, and my skin crawled with fear. Karen continued chanting, her voice growing louder to drown out the whispers. I felt something tugging at my shirt, and I turned to see a shadowy figure looming over me. Its eyes were hollow pits of darkness, and its mouth twisted into a sinister grin. I screamed and stumbled back, crashing into Jake. The figure lunged at us, but Karen threw a handful of salt at it, causing it to recoil with a horrifying screech. The whispers grew into a cacophony of voices, all shouting at once. Karen shouted the final words of the incantation, and the room exploded with a blinding light. When the light faded, the whispers were gone. The house was silent. Karen was on her knees, exhausted, but relieved. "It's weakened," she said, panting. "But it's not gone. You need to stay vigilant. This entity will try to find a way back." We thanked Karen and tried to get some rest, but sleep was impossible. Every creak, every rustle made us jump. We knew we were not safe. The next morning, we decided to leave town to put as much distance between us and the entity as possible. We packed up the car and hit the road. The drive was tense, each of us lost in our thoughts. We ended up at a motel in a small, quiet town, hoping it would be a safe place to regroup. As we checked in, the receptionist gave us a strange look. "You folks look like you've seen a ghost," she said, half joking. If only she knew. That night, I barely slept. The weight of what had happened, what was still happening, pressed down on me. In the early hours of the morning, I heard a familiar whisper. My blood ran cold. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. The whisper grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the bathroom. I crept towards the door, heart pounding. The whispering stopped as I reached for the handle. Slowly, I opened the door and shone my flashlight inside. The room was empty, but the mirror was fogged up. Written in the condensation were the words, "I will find you." When I saw those words on the mirror, my heart nearly stopped. "I will find you." It felt like a death sentence. I stood there, trembling, the flashlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. I knew we couldn't keep running forever. This thing, whatever it was relentless. I woke Jake and we quickly packed our bags. We decided to head to a larger city, hoping that being around more people might somehow deter the entity. The drive was nerve-wracking. Every dark stretch of road, every shadow, seemed like a potential threat. We barely spoke, each of us lost in our own fears. We arrived in the city just as dawn was breaking. The hustle and bustle of urban life provided a false sense of security. We found a hotel and checked in, hoping the crowded environment would offer some protection. Exhausted, we both crashed on our beds, but sleep was elusive. That evening, we decided to go out, to lose ourselves in the crowd and noise of the city. We ended up at a busy bar, trying to drink away our fear. The noise and the lights provided a temporary distraction, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I caught glimpses of shadows out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. As the night wore on, we stumbled back to the hotel, slightly drunk but more relaxed. Maybe this was the answer, I thought. Maybe we could drown out the fear. But that hope was shattered the moment we stepped into the elevator. The lights flickered and the air grew cold. The elevator lurched, then stopped between floors. We were trapped. The emergency light cast an eerie glow, and the whispers started again, low and menacing. Jake and I huddled together, clutching each other in terror. The whispers grew louder, filling the small space with an oppressive presence. I felt something brush against my leg, and I screamed, kicking out at the empty air. Suddenly the elevator jerked back to life, and we were moving again. The doors opened on our floor, and we stumbled out, hearts racing. We sprinted to our room, slamming the door behind us. The whispers had stopped, but the fear lingered. We knew it was only a matter of time before it came for us again. That night, I had a nightmare. I was back in the cabin, surrounded by darkness. The whispering voices were all around me, growing louder and more frantic. I felt a hand on my shoulder, cold and clammy. I turned to see the shadowy figure from the basement, its hollow eyes staring into mine. It opened its mouth, and a torrent of black, oily liquid poured out, engulfing me. I woke up screaming, drenched in sweat. Jake was already awake, his face pale. "We need to end this," he said. "We can't keep running. We need to fight back." I agreed, but I had no idea how. We decided to contact Karen again, hoping she could help us one more time. When we called her, she sounded worried, but agreed to meet us in the city. She arrived later that day, bringing with her an assortment of books and tools. "This entity is powerful," she said, "but it's not invincible. We need to perform a banishment ritual, something strong enough to sever its connection to you." We set up the ritual in our hotel room, arranging candles, herbs, and symbols in a precise pattern. Karen explained that the entity was feeding off our fear and that we needed to remain calm and focused during the ritual. Easier said than done, considering what we had been through. As night fell, the air grew heavy with anticipation. Karen began chanting, her voice steady and confident. Jake and I held hands, trying to project strength and courage. The room grew colder, and the whispers returned, more frantic and desperate. Shadows danced on the walls, coalescing into a dark figure that loomed over us. Karen's chanting grew louder, more forceful. The entity hissed, recoiling as if in pain. I felt a surge of hope. Maybe this would work. But then, the entity lunged at Karen, knocking her to the ground. The candles flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it at the entity, but it did nothing. Jake and I tried to help Karen up, but she was unconscious, her body limp. The entity loomed over us, its hollow eyes glowing with malevolent intent. Desperation took over. I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy book, and hurled it at the figure. To my surprise, it passed through the entity, hitting the wall with a dull thud. The entity hissed again, retreating slightly. It was weakened, but not defeated. Karen stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "Finish the ritual," she gasped. "You have to finish it." With trembling hands, I picked up the chant where Karen had left off. The words felt foreign and awkward, but I forced myself to keep going. Jake joined in, his voice shaky but determined. The entity writhed and shrieked, its form flickering like a dying flame. The room grew colder still, and I felt a pressure building in my chest, as if the air itself was being sucked out. The entity lunged at us again, but this time it seemed weaker, less substantial. We kept chanting, our voices growing louder, more insistent. The shadows swirled around us, but we stood our ground. Suddenly there was a blinding flash of light, and the entity let out a final, ear-piercing scream. The shadows dissolved, and the room was filled with an eerie silence. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight lifted. We had done it. We had banished the entity. Karen lay on the floor, breathing heavily but alive. Jake and I helped her to her feet, our bodies trembling with exhaustion and relief. "It's over," she said weakly. "It's finally over." We thanked Karen profusely, knowing we owed her our lives. She warned us that the entity might still be out there, but its hold on us was broken. We needed to stay vigilant, to protect ourselves from any further attacks. As we sat in the aftermath, processing what had just happened, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had only just begun to understand the darkness we had encountered. The cabin, the entity, the whispers. It all felt like a nightmare, one that we might never fully escape. But for now, we were safe. And that was enough. After the banishment ritual, Jake and I felt a strange sense of calm. We decided to stay in the city for a few more days, just to be sure. Karen stayed with us, monitoring the situation and providing much-needed reassurance. For the first time in weeks, we managed to get some restful sleep. However, it wasn't long before the uneasy feeling returned. It was subtle at first. Small things, like the temperature dropping suddenly or hearing faint whispers late at night. Karen insisted it was normal, that we were still on edge and our minds were playing tricks on us. But the incidents grew more frequent and more disturbing. On the third night after the ritual, I woke up to the sound of scratching at the hotel room door. My heart sank as I recognized the familiar, sinister sound. I nudged Jake awake, and we both stared at the door, holding our breath. The scratching continued, slow and deliberate, like nails on a chalkboard. Karen stirred, sensing our fear. She grabbed her bag of tools and started chanting softly. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by an ominous silence. We waited, tense and alert, but nothing happened. We hoped it was a one-time occurrence, but deep down, we knew better. The next day, Karen suggested we visit a local historian who specialized in folklore and paranormal activity. She believed understanding the entity's origin might help us find a permanent solution. The historian, Dr. Caldwell, was a stern-looking man with a wealth of knowledge about the supernatural. He listened intently as we recounted our experiences, his face growing grimmer with each detail. "This entity," he said, "is not a mere ghost. It is something much darker, much older. It's what some cultures refer to as a shadow demon. These beings are drawn to fear and despair, feeding off the negative energy." He explained that shadow demons were incredibly difficult to banish completely. They were persistent and cunning, often finding ways to return. Dr. Caldwell recommended a powerful, ancient ritual that could potentially sever the entity's connection to us for good. The ritual required rare ingredients and precise execution, but we were willing to do whatever it took. We spent the next 2 days gathering the necessary items: black salt, blessed candles, a sacred talisman, and a rare herb known as nightshade. Dr. Caldwell guided us through the preparations, emphasizing the importance of focus and unity. Any mistake could have dire consequences. The night of the ritual, we set everything up in a secluded part of the city, away from prying eyes. The air was thick with tension as we formed a circle, the candles casting long, flickering shadows. Dr. Caldwell began the incantation, his voice deep and commanding. Karen, Jake, and I joined in, our voices blending into a harmonious chant. As the ritual progressed, the temperature dropped sharply, and a cold wind whipped around us. The shadows grew darker, more tangible, as if they were alive. We could feel the entity's presence, a malevolent force trying to break through. The ground beneath us trembled, and a guttural growl echoed through the night. The shadows coalesced into a towering, amorphous figure with glowing eyes and a twisted, malevolent grin. It lunged at us, but the circle of protection held it at bay. Dr. Caldwell's chant grew louder, more forceful, as he called upon ancient powers to banish the demon. The entity thrashed and writhed, its form flickering like a dying flame. The pressure was immense, a palpable force pushing against us. I felt my strength waning, but I knew I couldn't falter. We continued chanting, pouring every ounce of our will into the ritual. The entity let out a final, ear-piercing shriek before exploding into a cloud of black smoke. The wind howled, and then just as suddenly as it had started, everything went still. The oppressive weight lifted, and the air felt lighter, cleaner. We collapsed to the ground, exhausted but relieved. Dr. Caldwell assured us that the entity was banished, its connection to us severed. It wouldn't be able to return. In the days that followed, the whispers and shadows ceased. The sense of dread that had haunted us was gone. We returned to our lives, forever changed, but grateful for a second chance. Jake and I kept in touch with Karen and Dr. Caldwell, forming a bond forged in the crucible of fear and survival. Despite the ordeal, we couldn't shake the feeling that we had glimpsed into a world beyond our understanding. The cabin, the entity, the darkness, they were part of a larger, more terrifying reality. But for now, we were free. And that was enough. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I think back to those dark days. The memories are vivid, etched into my mind like scars. I know the world is full of mysteries and horrors we can never fully comprehend. But I've learned to cherish the light, to hold on to hope, even in the darkest of times. Because sometimes, that's all we have.